All right, here's chapter 12, which is going to be on firms with market power, as it says. So we're going to focus on monopolies and on monopolistic competition. If you remember, I think back in the previous chapter on pure competition, we showed a little timeline spectrum thing where we had different levels of competitiveness, where you had pure competition on one end, monopoly on the other end, and you had in the middle these sort of intermediate types of industries, monopolistic competition and oligopolies. So we will do monopolies and monopolistic competition today. We can start with that. What do we mean by this term market power? Of course, it means the ability to raise your price and without losing any sales. With pure competition, with the apple farmers that we had before, they didn't have any ability to change the price or raise the price at all because they would lose all of their sales since the substitutes were so readily available and were such perfect substitutes. But of course, that's not true in all industries. Some firms have the ability to raise their price, and they may lose some of their sales, but not all. So their ability to do that indicates that they have some degree of market power. Of course, this means that if they have the ability to do this, then their demand curve is not horizontal anymore, because again, if you have a horizontal demand curve, as in pure competition, when you raise the price, you lose all of your sales. But if the demand curve is downward sloping, not horizontal, then you do have the ability to raise price. You'll lose some sales, but not all of them. What will end up happening as a result of this downward sloping demand and the firm's ability to keep some of their customers is that they're going to set a price higher than marginal revenue. They'll set the price higher than marginal cost. So of course, with firms with market power, typically, we think of monopolies as the prime example of this. Prices end up being higher than they would be in the competitive markets. And because there's no competition, at least for monopolies at the beginning here, we'll modify that a little bit for monopolistic competition. But for monopolies, since there is no competition, that means that any profit that the monopolist earns, they can keep. Let's put it this way. They don't have to worry about competing firms entering and sort of eating that profit away like we saw in the previous chapter. It's helpful to try to get a quantitative sense of how much market power different industries have, or firms in different industries have. If you have a pure monopoly where there's just one firm, you don't really need to do a whole lot of measuring. You can see that, well, there's just one firm in this industry and not a whole lot of need to quantify anything. But for those intermediate stages, and even in industries where we might think it's purely competitive, obviously no industry is going to be purely competitive and fit the definition of perfect competition perfectly. So we want to get a sense of how can we tell how much industry concentration there is, how much market power there actually is. And of course, this is going to depend on how many substitutes there are. In pure competition, there are perfect substitutes, and in monopoly, there's no substitutes. So the amount of market power you have depends on how many substitutes are available, which depends itself on the elasticity of demand. Of course, if there's, like I said, fewer substitutes, then we say demand is less elastic, and that means that individual firms have more market power. So perfectly competitive firms have no market power because, again, their demand is perfectly elastic. There's tons of substitutes out there. One kind of easy way we can measure how much market power there is by what they call this Lerner index. I can show you what the equation looks like. So it's essentially just a percentage showing you how the current price the firm charges differs from its marginal cost. In the competitive case, we saw that the price equaled marginal cost. That ended up being the purely competitive firm's decision rule. They would set their price equal to marginal cost. And so, the Lerner index there would be 0 because there would be no difference between the two. And for firms that do have market power, they're able to charge higher prices than marginal cost. And so to the degree they can do that, we can measure that percentage difference between the current price P and whatever that firm's marginal cost is. And that gives us a sense of the degree of market power. Obviously, the smaller this Lerner index is, then the more competitive the industry in which that firm is located. The larger the index, meaning the larger the price is above marginal cost, then that would indicate that there's more market power that this individual firm is able to exercise. You can see below that there's also this relationship between the elasticity value and the Lerner index, which we would expect. We could also get a sense of the degree of market power by looking at the cross-price elasticities. We did that to uncover whether there was any sort of relationship between the price of one good and the quantity demanded of another good. And we said that for products that are highly substitutable, we would expect there would be a strong relationship between the two of them. Not just high, substitutes, but complements as well. But in this case, if we're thinking about firms that have market power, that would indicate that there aren't good substitutes for that firm's products. So we can use the cross-price elasticity and measure how substitutable two products are. for firms that have a lot of market power, they have this ability, or consumers believe, that there aren't any good substitutes for that product. And so in that case, you would maybe find a cross-price elasticity that indicates some degree of substitutability, but it would be fairly low, meaning, again, that consumers at least don't think that there are any good substitutes for what this particular firm produces. I guess a second or third, I can't keep track, measure of the amount of market power is a concentration ratio. And sometimes you'll hear this as a 3-firm concentration ratio or a 4-firm, always indicating the number of firms that this concentration ratio is supposed to relate to. And it's essentially just a measure of the top however many firms these top firms represent for the entire industry. So if we thought about, well, if we're thinking of sales, the top 3 firms have what percentage of sales of the entire industry? So I gave a little example there. If the top 3 firms have $27 million of sales and the entire industry has $100 million of sales, then you would say, well, the top 3 firms have 27%. So that gives you a sense of how concentrated the industry is somewhat, because it tells you at least what the top firms, how much of the entire market the top 3 firms represent. And of course, you can do the top 4 firms or the top however many firms you want to do. It doesn't have to just be 3. You just sort of modify that calculation. You can use different measures too. I mean, you don't have to use the sales as your measure. You could use the amount of output or any number of things to calculate this. It's an interesting way of measuring market power. It can be a little misleading because you might think of the top 3 firms having a certain amount of sales, and it doesn't really say anything about how many other firms there are in the industry. You could conceive of getting the same sort of numerical result of having a 3-firm concentration ratio of 27% if the top 3 firms had maybe $25 million and then $1 million and then $1 million. If those were the top 3 firms, and again, the biggest one had $25 million in sales, the second place one had $1 million, and the third place one had $1 million, you would still get a 3-firm concentration ratio of 27%. But that particular industry would be a lot more like a monopoly than the example that we have here. So concentration ratio can be helpful. It can be somewhat misleading too, so it's always good. I've kind of tried to stress this in a few other places. It's always good to not just rely on one single piece of data to represent what you're interested in. So if you're going to talk about market power in an industry, you may use the concentration ratio, but you may use some of these others as well. One that's very commonly used is the Herfindahl index. And this requires a little more information because you need to know the market shares of all of the firms in the industry. With the concentration ratio, you only need to know the market share of the top 3 or the top 4 or however many you're interested in. And you don't really care about the rest of them. You just need to know about the amount of sales in the entire industry. And you can find that sort of stuff through the Census Bureau pretty easily, how much the entire industry produces. And you can look at annual reports of the top 3 firms to get those values. To do the Herfindahl index, you need all of them. You need the market shares of every firm in that industry, and so it requires a lot more data on the part of the researcher. But it's a lot more accurate as well, because again, you're getting information on all of the firms that are out there. And it's essentially taking the market shares and squaring them, and it's kind of weird. You'd think the market share is a percent, so if for that first industry or that first firm, if we said, well, that first firm has 10% of the market share, you would think we would do 0.1 and square that, but we don't do that. We drop the percent sign and we just say, well, if the first firm has a 10% market share, we're going to say 10 squared, and if the second biggest firm has a 9% market share, we will do 9 squared, etc. So you square those and you add them up, and that gives you the Herfindahl index value. For purely competitive industries, obviously theoretically, each individual firm is so tiny that they have 0% market share. And so you would just have 0 squared plus 0 squared, etc. And that would just equal to 0 for the Herfindahl value. In a monopoly case, you have one firm that has 100% market share. And so you just do 100 squared, and that gives you a value of 10,000. And for the intermediate cases, again, you get some value that's in between that range. One of the things that is interesting about the Herfindahl index is that it's actually used in the Justice Department. When they're looking at antitrust cases, they will look at the Herfindahl index of a proposed merger between 2 companies. They'll look at it, what the Herfindahl index value is prior to the merger, and then what it would be after the merger, presuming that all the customers kind of stay with the companies pre and post. If you just go to Google and sort of Google Department of Justice Herfindahl, you'll probably get that one page that kind of tells you, it'll give you an example of how the Herfindahl index is calculated, and it will give you their little criteria. I can't remember offhand, but if the industry is, say, a Herfindahl index of 2,500, and if the merger causes the Herfindahl to increase by 200 points or something like that, then they look at that merger really closely. And those are ways of measuring market power. We can talk about monopolies now. We actually built a lot of the tools that we're going to need in the pure competition chapter. We've sort of done a lot of the legwork already. There's going to be a few modifications that we'll do, but you'll see that maybe half of what we're going to talk about with this monopoly section is going to be things that you're already familiar with. So clearly a monopoly produces a product that consumers consider there are no good substitutes for. And this is sort of just restating the same thing. That means there's only one firm, and we want to make this assumption that new firms cannot enter easily because of some barrier to entry. In the competitive case, it was very easy to start up a new apple farm, and so if a particular apple farmer was charging a high price, well, people would come in quickly and eat away that profit. If there were those situations in the short run where all of the existing firms were earning profit, then new entrepreneurs would start up and again compete away all of the profit that was there by shifting out the market supply curve. We have to sort of presume in this case that that's not going to be true. With a monopoly, again, it's a single seller, and they are relatively protected because of barriers to entry. So monopolists don't technically have to worry about new competitors coming in. That doesn't mean they don't have to worry about anything. There's kind of a lot of myths that we'll try to dissolve about what they can do, the influence they have. I think society tends to think that monopolists have a lot more power than they actually do. So we'll try to dispel some of those myths. Monopolists are trying to keep other competitors out. They might not have to actively try to keep competitors out, but there may be other sorts of barriers to entry that just make it difficult for new competitors to come in. If new firms came in, then it would reduce the market power because there'd be more substitutes out there. So the monopolist benefits when there are these strong barriers to entry. A barrier to entry is just something that makes it difficult for a new entrepreneur to start up. Some of these could be economies of scale. We mentioned this when we did the cost curves, when we did the long run cost curves. Again, economies of scale are just a long downward sloping portion of the long run average total cost curve, so that the monopolist is at an advantage, at a cost advantage in production, because they can produce products at a very low per unit cost. Whereas if a new firm wanted to start up, they would presumably only be able to produce a small amount of output at the beginning. If they did that, they would have very high expenses if they had the same sort of average total cost curve. So the monopolist has this cost advantage. Presumably they would be able to charge a lower price for their product too. And that's a way of keeping new entrants out. You basically, if you were a new entrant, you'd essentially have to be able to start big, which is kind of counterintuitive just in the definition. Being able to start big to be able to compete with the monopolist and the cost advantage they have. A lot of the monopolies that we actually have are licensed or created by governments. We have Comcast Cable in Shreveport. I think Bossier probably still has Suddenlink. We have SWEPCO in our areas too that provide electricity. And so these are private companies and they are monopolies. The reason they are monopolies is the city government has allowed them to be. I'm sure Suddenlink would probably like to compete with Comcast and offer similar service to Shreveport customers at a cheaper price, but they're not allowed to. There's a license that the government grants to Comcast and allows them to come in. And so Comcast, SWEPCO, they enjoy a monopoly power within the city of Shreveport. Some of you may be familiar with the De Beers Diamond Company, and they certainly produce a lot of diamonds. Their argument may be that they don't have any sort of monopoly on the sale of diamonds, I'll put it that way. The production of final product diamonds. They don't have any specific monopoly in that. What they do have is they own most of the land in Africa where diamonds are mined. And so they control pretty much the only place where diamonds actually come from out of the ground. And that certainly helps them to maintain their monopoly status if you can't find diamonds any other place. So we sort of hinted at some of those where the monopolist maintains their market power because of things within their own control. They have these economies of scale, or they're granted this license, or they control a particular input. But companies may be able to achieve monopoly status throughout any sort of, I don't want to say underhanded behavior, but throughout any sort of activity of their own. Customers may result in a firm being a monopoly. They may just have this strong brand loyalty. a new firm comes in, I guess I'm thinking of airlines. There's not really monopolies in airlines, but it's certainly difficult to start up. The economies of scale are pretty huge in the airline industry. And I don't know about you, I'd be a little nervous getting on some new company's airline if they'd only been around for 3 weeks and this is their second flight or something like that. So customers probably have pretty strong allegiance to the existing firms that are out there, and they might not be too keen on getting on some new guy's plane if they'd never heard of this company. There's this concept called consumer lock-in. It's a way of maintaining monopoly status or erecting these entry barriers that come from consumers. And one of the ways this may occur is if consumers just find it difficult to switch from one product to another. I grew up knowing how to play with Windows computers, and I can install them from the ground up, and I just am familiar with the way Windows works. I don't think I'd have any idea how to do anything with a Mac. I mean, the only real Apple product I have is my iPhone. So I'd certainly have high costs in trying to switch to a new laptop. At least that psychologically, I think I would. I'm sure I could probably figure it out pretty quickly. But with lots of products like this, consumers may feel like, well, I kind of know how this particular product works, and I don't really want to spend the time and effort to learn about this new product. You may be familiar with this in your companies that you're working at. If there's a new software program or a new accounting package that they're considering, or I know my brother works for the HR department of an insurance company back in Michigan, and he's always talking about a new software that comes out and they have weeks of training on it and trying to get it implemented. So they're not really playing with consumers, but consumers may have the same sort of behavior where they just feel like it's very expensive to try to switch to a new brand, and so they're not really willing to buy the products of a monopolist's competitor, and so the monopolist maintains their power. Another concept called network externalities, where I gain more benefit from the use of a particular product the greater the number of consumers who also use it. Again, I'm just thinking of my iPhone again. One of the nice things that I can probably depend on is if I get in a room with 20 people and my iPhone dies, I could probably count on at least 1 or 2 of those people having one of the little cords that I could plug my phone in. So it certainly makes having an iPhone better and more beneficial and makes me happier using it if I know that a lot of other people have it too. And of course, it's hard for a competitor to come in if the number of users of a new firm or the number of consumers of a new firm is fairly small. They don't gain the benefits of these, what we call network externalities. We described how the monopolist maintains its market power. New entrants are barred from being able to enter. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the graphical details and see how these monopolists make their pricing and output decisions. When we talked about purely competitive firms, we didn't have to worry about a pricing decision because, well, there was just a single price for this good, and the firm was a price taker. They didn't have any control over the price they could charge for the apple. So the only thing that the firm did was decide on the output. How much should we produce? And of course, they used that marginal revenue equals marginal cost rule, and they were able to substitute a little bit and say, let's just operate where price equals marginal cost. So they only made an output decision. They didn't have to worry about price. For the monopolists, though, there's no other competitors to worry about. They have market power. They can charge presumably whatever price they want. They're not going to. There's going to be one single price they find is best. But they have the ability to set price. And so they also want to set the quantity or the output as well. A distinction we can make is when we talked about the competitive firms, we said there was this distinction between the market demand and the firm demand. The market demand was the entire market's demand for apples, so every consumer and the amount of demand they had for all of the apples that were produced by all of the apple farmers. But then we also thought about this different question of, well, how much demand does Farmer Bob have for just his apples, not for any of the others? So we made this distinction between the market demand and the firm demand. The market demand was the market demand curve, this downward sloping thing. The firm demand was the horizontal demand for Farmer Bob's apples. In the monopolist case, since there is only one firm now, there's no other competitors out there, then the firm demand that the monopolist faces is exactly equal to the market demand of all apples. So if presumably Farmer Bob was a monopolist, then the demand for his apples would be exactly equal to the demand that everyone has for all kinds of apples. One thing that's going to be a little different in the monopolist case, again, in the pure competition case, the demand curve was horizontal. So if Farmer Bob wanted to sell an additional apple, the price he would charge would be exactly the same price as all of the others. The marginal revenue that would come in would be exactly the same as the price. Because he was so small that increasing his sales by 1 unit was a pretty small drop in the bucket as far as the apple market goes. In the monopolist case, though, the demand curve is downward sloping. And so if the monopolist wants to increase sales, they can't just do that haphazardly. The only way you can increase sales on a downward sloping demand curve is to lower the price. And if you do that, then that means that whatever price you are currently charging, again, marginal revenue means if we were to sell one more unit, how much extra revenue would come in? Well, if you're charging $1 for your apples now, and you want to sell one more of them, on a downward sloping demand curve, you can't charge $1. You have to charge something less than that to entice people to buy that extra apple, because again, the demand curve is downward sloping. So that would mean that even though your current price might be $1, the marginal revenue might be 90 cents. As it says, the marginal revenue is always going to be less than the price, except for the very first unit. But for really what's interesting to us is that this idea that the marginal revenue is always going to be less than the price for the monopolist. What we're going to end up finding is that if the demand curve is linear, the marginal revenue curve is also going to be linear. It's going to have the same intercept, the vertical intercept, as the demand curve, and it's going to be twice as steep. You don't necessarily have to remember that. I think we have a algebra calculus example coming up in the slides, and you'll kind of see why that has to be true. So here's our graphical setup. We've got the price, marginal revenue, the dollar amount on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. Here's our market demand curve, also the monopolist's demand curve. The marginal revenue is always less than the price. Well, again, the price is what the demand curve is, and the marginal revenue is less than that. So one way you can demonstrate that is by the marginal revenue curve being lower than the demand curve. When the demand curve was horizontal, you had the marginal revenue line was essentially right on top of the demand curve. They were sort of the exact same line. What happens when there's any degree of market power, the demand curve goes from being horizontal and it starts to tilt downwards, starts to have this downward slope. As that happens, because of the downward sloping of the demand curve, the marginal revenue line sort of splits away from it and falls even faster. That's kind of how I think of why these curves look the way that they do. So the monopolist has to make these same decisions. I want to make as much profit as we can off of these, not just the amount we sell, but the price we charge too. So monopolist wants to maximize profits just like any other company does. They're going to make the exact same decisions that the competitive firm did. We want to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So there's nothing different here. If you think back to when we showed the total revenue and the total cost lines, we had the total revenue line was this upward sloping thing. The total cost line was like this S-shaped thing, and we saw that the highest amount of profit was where the two lines were parallel, and that meant they had the same slope. And so we could use this rule that as long as the slopes are equal, that gives you a good sense where the profit maximization occurs. That's true for any company you're talking about, whether it's purely competitive, monopoly, or even in the monopolistic competition that we'll talk about in a little bit. So they follow the exact same rule. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The price for the output is going to be given by where the demand curve is. All the same sort of decisions that we said before about, well, is this company going to be profitable? Is it going to be earning a loss but stay open? Is it going to be shut down? All of that's going to be exactly the same as we did for the purely competitive case. So if the price is greater than average total cost, well, the firm makes a profit. If the price is below average total but above the variable, then, well, the firm makes a loss, but they can still pay their employees, so it's a loss, but you stay open, in the short run at least. If you can't even pay your workers, you shut down. So all of that foundation that we built in the previous competitive chapter, that follows through here as well. Let's put our cost curves back in here. Monopolist has cost curves that don't really look any different from the other companies, the competitive companies. But now let's throw our demand and marginal revenue lines in. First thing we want to do is figure out where the marginal revenue equal marginal cost. And you can see it at the intersection of the dark black marginal revenue line and the dark red SMC line. Just like we did in the competitive case, you figure out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that will determine the quantity that you're going to set. So this company wants to sell 200 units. I can stop there already and kind of dispel one of the monopoly myths. We tend to think that, well, monopolists, they just want to get as big as they can, and they're going to sell as much as they can, and they're going to drive competitors out of business by volume. Well, there would be no reason why this monopolist would sell any more than 200 units. That would be the upper limit of the amount of output this company would produce. Actually, when we get into, I don't know if we talk about it here, if you were to compare a monopoly with purely competitive firms, the monopoly actually produces less output than purely competitive firms do. So this notion that monopolists just try to become gargantuan and drive competitors out of business, in the short run at least, isn't going to necessarily be true. They're going to have an upper limit. They're going to have an optimal amount of output that they want to produce that they don't want to deviate from. So the monopolist wants to sell 200 units. Now we have to figure out what price this monopolist wants to charge, and you may be tempted to sort of, you can see where the intersection happens between marginal revenue and marginal cost, that little black dot there. You may be tempted to sort of trace a horizontal line to the left of that dot and say, well, that's where the price is going to be, exactly where that intersection is. But remember that the monopolist wants to sell 200 units, and you might as well try to sell it at as high a price as you can to entice people to buy 200 units. So what price could you charge to get people to buy 200 units? Well, that's what the demand curve tells you. If I want people to buy 200 units, then I just have to trace that quantity, 200, up to where the demand curve is, which ends up being at a lot higher price than where the actual, marginal revenue, marginal cost intersection occurs. So if I want to sell 200 units, the demand curve tells me that I can charge a price of $7 to do that. Well, we'd have to do the, is it profitable or not? Well, clearly if I charge a price of $7 at point B, I can see that point B is far above point C, which is the average total cost curve. So I know this company is charging a price of $7, their per unit cost is only $5, so they're very profitable. We always think, society always tells, oh, monopolies make all this profit and they just rip off consumers. That doesn't have to be true at all. It depends on where these cost curves are. You can just think of monopolies you may know about, like the post office or Amtrak. I haven't heard anyone worrying about the amount of profits those companies have been making. So monopolists certainly don't have to be super profitable all the time. It depends on where the cost curves are. So let's throw some cost curves back in there. And again, what's this monopolist going to do? Well, I need to figure out at what quantity is marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So the dark black line, the dark red line again, gives me that quantity of 50. And I want to figure out, well, what price do I charge? Well, I figure out at a quantity of 50, where is 50 units associated with the demand curve? So I trace that up. And I can see at point C, that tells me what the price is, $75. I'm going to charge $75 per unit to sell 50 units. Am I profitable or not? Well, I can see that the price I'm charging at point C, $75, is below the average total cost curve at point B, above it, at $80. So I'm making a $5 loss on selling these units. Should I shut down? Well, again, you figure out where's the average variable cost curve. I know I'm earning a loss, but should I shut down now? Well, I can see that point C is at least above point F on the average variable cost curve. So I'm earning a loss, but I can still afford to pay my workers, so I stay open. So again, it all depends on where these curves are in relation to one another. And this figuring out whether you're profitable or lost and stay open, and we did all that back in the purely competitive chapter. So there's not a whole lot of new stuff here. The demand curve, marginal revenue curve looks a little odd, but our decision rules about what quantity we should charge, are you profitable or not, all of that is exactly the same as we did before. You can see the amount of the loss there. In the long run, basically the same rules. Oh, there's lots of curves there. If you had a long run marginal cost curve, you would just make the same decisions that we did before. They jump into this section about profit maximizing input usage, which I believe we also did back in the previous chapter, so there's not going to be a whole lot of new stuff here. We mentioned before that you can make a output decision that maximizes profit. You can also make an input decision that will basically result in the same decisions, the same amount of profit maximizing output, the same profit maximizing amount of inputs. So again, we want to do this marginal revenue, marginal cost comparison. If you're thinking about inputs, amount of workers you want to hire as your inputs, then again, we want to sort of translate, well, what do we mean by a marginal benefit and a marginal cost? Well, the benefit of hiring someone is this marginal revenue product, which we described before. If you hire a person, then they produce output, which is the marginal product, and you can sell that output to earn revenue. That should be price times the marginal product. I'm not sure, we'll have to change that slide. So the marginal revenue product equals what the change in total revenue would be from hiring an additional laborer, but that should equal the price of the product times the worker's marginal product. Again, if you can hire someone and the worker is able to produce an additional 5 units for you that you sell at $10 a piece, then that worker brings you $50 extra. So that would be the marginal benefit of hiring someone, and you think about what's the marginal cost of hiring someone. Well, it's whatever you have to pay them, whatever that input price is. And again, you want to continue hiring people until the marginal revenue product equals the wage. And I think we described the reasoning there. If you're considering hiring someone and they brought in a lot more money for you than they cost you, then you would certainly want to hire that person. As you do that, though, as you hire more people, if we remember the law of diminishing returns, the marginal product declines eventually as labor increases. So as you continue to hire people, the price of the product probably stays the same, but the marginal product of your workers starts to fall. So if you were at a situation where for the number of employees you have, the marginal revenue product was greater than the wage, you say, well, we want to keep hiring people. As you do that, the marginal product starts to decline, and eventually your marginal revenue product declines. And you eventually get to the point where you've hired enough people such that the marginal revenue product equals the wage. And that's kind of your optimum level. Whichever option you choose, whichever choice you decide to make, whether you're going to choose an optimal amount of output or an optimal amount of inputs, you're going to end up with the same sort of conclusion. So that was monopoly. We didn't really talk about, we made this short run distinction, and you remember in the pure competition case, we said purely competitive firms may be earning a profit in the short run, but then in the long run, there's all this competition and new firms enter and it eats the profit away. So we had this discussion of sort of a short run, purely competitive firm, and then what happens in the long run. We made this digression of a long run result. We didn't really have to do that in the monopoly case because there's no other competitors to worry about. I should have mentioned a few things too. I think people tend to give monopolies a lot more power than they have. There's some reason to believe that monopolies aren't going to be all powerful. One of them is just sort of historical. You think of some companies that have seemed like monopolies at the time. You guys probably remember IBM. I mean, they were the big PC company. If you wanted a PC, you had to get it from IBM 20 years ago. There was no other company around. I don't think IBM even makes PCs anymore. They might make laptops. I don't really know. They were a monopoly, but certainly not now. I asked my undergrads what browser they used, and they all said, Chrome, Firefox, Safari. And I said, oh, none of you use Netscape Navigator? And they kind of didn't know what the heck I was talking about. And I said, that was the browser, about when I started using my AOL dial-up. You use Netscape Navigator. And so where are they now? One argument against being that worried about monopolies is that they don't tend to last very long. Who knows why? I mean, different reasons. But another aspect of monopolies, like we saw with when you have to consider the cost curves too, if you were the only game in town, you don't have to worry about anything. Well, those cost curves may start to creep up as your company doesn't really worry about efficiencies very much. Then they might start to get lazy, management starts to get lazy, and as they do that, those cost curves creep up, and whatever monopoly profits were being earned before, they might sort of be dissipated. Which I guess kind of says two things. We shouldn't expect monopolies to always be profitable, but we shouldn't also expect that monopolies are always going to be lazy, because clearly it's in a monopolist's advantage, or to a monopolist's advantage, to try to become more efficient, because as they do that, they push their cost curves down and they make more profit for themselves. So again, this notion that either monopolies are always profitable is certainly not guaranteed. And the notion that, well, they're always going to be lazy and not care about customer service or efficiency or anything like that, that's kind of short-sighted too, because monopolies have an incentive to be efficient, to generate more profits for themselves. A third sort of thing to note is that monopolists have no control at all over the demand for their product. I mean, we might think, well, there's no other substitutes out there. There's always a substitute for every product you can think of, and that is to not buy the product at all. That doesn't sound like a very good substitute, but no one's forcing people to buy the products of a monopoly. So if you could think of the cost curves that a monopolist might have and the demand and marginal revenue that are there, if people just get sick of this company and they don't want to use this product anymore, if people get sick of Comcast and their customer service and they decide, well, I'm going to use DirecTV or Dish Network or whatever, or just watch stuff over the internet, then, well, the demand and marginal revenue curves are going to start to shrink for Comcast. And as they shrink, they move to the left. If you could think of the cost curve staying in place, but the demand and marginal revenue curves moving down and to the left, that's going to eat away at the monopolist's profits too. So for all these reasons, again, I think people tend to become more worried about monopolies than they really need to be. But anyway, you're probably hoping that you can see something new on the slide. Monopolistic competition is going to be one of the intermediate types of market structures. It's closer to the competitive end, so there's going to be a lot of aspects of competition in this sort of an industry, but it's got the monopoly word in there, so it'll be kind of a combination of them both. Like competitive firms, there's a large number of them, and like monopolies, they are going to sell a product that is different. When we say there's no substitutes for a product in a monopoly, we essentially mean that it's different from anything else. So with monopolistically competitive firms, you get this kind of combination where there's a large number of firms, but they each sell a product that they try to differentiate one from another. the products that they sell are pretty close substitutes, but we wouldn't call them perfect substitutes. And maybe this is just me, I always think of pizza in this example. If you ask some people, pizza is pizza, not really that different one from companies from another. But if you care about pizza at all, like I do, there are differences. I mean, there's certainly a big difference between Pieworks Pizza and CiCi's Pizza. So they're certainly close substitutes, but they're definitely not perfect. And what this means is that the individual companies, if they're able to differentiate enough, they're able to obtain market power. They're able to convince their customers, or their customers may believe on their own, that the products that these companies sell are sort of in a class by themselves. There's nothing really that comes close to being a good substitute for it. So they're able to become sort of little monopolies. They obtain some market power. Obviously, Pieworks, if enough people think that Pieworks Pizza is good, and that CiCi's is not really a close substitute for it, then Pieworks has the ability then to raise its price a little bit. Of course, they can't be egregious. They can't charge $40 for a large, because then people will go to CiCi's and say, look, these are decent enough substitutes. I'm not going to pay $40 for it. But if it's $3, $4 more than CiCi's, then sure, people will go to Pieworks instead. These markets are going to be competitive. There's a large number of firms out there. There's lots of pizza places in town, and it's easy to start up a new one. So again, these industries have kind of combinations of the characteristics of both types of industries that we've talked about before. Because Pieworks is able to convince its customers that its pizza is a little different, then its customers are willing to pay a higher price for it to a certain degree. That means that Pieworks' demand curve is not horizontal anymore, like Farmer Bob's, but it's downward sloping, like the monopoly. So the short run situation is going to look exactly like the monopoly. The picture, the monopolistic competition picture, is going to look just like the monopoly, and the way they decide prices and output and whether they're profitable or not, all that's going to be exactly the same as the monopoly case. But as I finished saying, with the monopoly case, you didn't have to worry about new firms coming in the long run. Well, we will have to worry about that now, because if Pieworks is making a ton of money profiting off its pizza, then because it's easy to start up a new pizza place, there will be new entrepreneurs coming in. So even though Pieworks is able to convince people that its pizza is a little different, then it's going to have to worry about competitors. Because there is the ability of new firms to enter, we're going to get the competitive result that in the long run, firms always break even. Price equals the long run average total cost. And just like in the monopoly and just like in pure competition, they're going to make this decision about setting their output where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that's going to be the same. Here's our cost curves, there's our demand and marginal revenue. Again, the output decision will be the same as the monopoly, the price they charge, they get all that profit. So then what happens in the long run? Well, if you could think of a firm that's kind of like Pieworks, and maybe it's kind of a monopoly, it has a lot of demand for its particular product, so its demand curve is really far out to the right. It would have a particular quantity and price that it charges, and let's say it's very profitable. You can see that over a long range of its demand, the demand curve is high above the average total cost curve. It's charging a really high price, making all this profit, and there's going to be new firms come in. The way that we demonstrate the entry of new firms is not necessarily to going back into the market supply and demand and shifting the supply curve around. We can just say, let's just look at Pieworks here. If new entrepreneurs come in, Pieworks is going to lose some customers to the new entrants. And so what that's going to reduce the demand for Pieworks. It'll shift it to the left. And it will do this enough until Pieworks breaks even. Pieworks is making less profit than it used to, but still some positive profit. Well, that's still going to encourage entry, and new businesses will come in. Pieworks will continue to lose customers to those new businesses. Its demand will shift back to the left even more until you get to this break-even point, which again is exactly the same result as the competitive case, that they always break even in the long run. And again, you can see they're breaking even because at that dot on the demand curve, the second demand curve that you can see, it's also intersecting at the same place as the long run average total cost. So monopolistically competitive firms, even though they may profit in the short run, they break even in the long run. They go through these 5 or 6 steps of taking data that you may have and helping to make these decisions for yourself. So kind of a quantitative way of analyzing all of this. Well, you have to estimate your demand. You have to know what your demand curve looks like. So you use data and run regressions and do all kinds of funky things to get your demand curve. So you get this sort of linear equation. Q is a function of price. You want to find your inverse demand equation so you can get this downward sloping line on the axes that we want, where price is some function of Q. And you got lots of your A's and your A apostrophes and weird notation like that. We need to know the marginal revenue curve. Essentially, I should have mentioned this too, most of these steps are going to be the same for if your company is a monopoly. To try to do the profit maximizing output and pricing decision for a monopoly, it's going to be essentially the same way, because again, the picture looks the same. But you need to know your marginal revenue once you have your demand equation. And I mentioned before that there's these special characteristics where the marginal revenue will intersect at the same vertical intercept, and it will have twice the slope. Well, if your demand equation is P equals A plus B times Q, then I know that total revenue is going to be price times quantity. So I'm going to multiply a Q by every term in my P equation. So they don't show it here, but the total revenue equation would be A times Q plus B times Q squared. So then when I want marginal revenue, I need to take the derivative of total revenue with respect to Q. And if I do that, the derivative, which is the marginal revenue, becomes A plus, and then that second power comes down and you get 2 times BQ. So that's why they were able to say that you get the same intercept, A, and the slope of marginal revenue is twice as steep as the demand line, because you've got a 2 times B. So you're able to graph what the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve looks like. You need to throw your cost curves in there, do all the stuff we did from chapter 10. Graphically, this may be more or less easy to figure out where the output occurs, the Q, where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Maybe a little trickier. I think in one of the equations we usually have to do the quadratic equation. But you could, again, graphically, you might be able to sort of hone in somewhat on what that optimal Q is. And then once you know what the Q is, you can kind of go back to your demand equation and just plug that Q in to get the price you need, the profit maximizing price. And you can, again, compare that price to what the average variable cost is, what the average total cost is, to figure out whether you're profitable or not. So we mentioned this before. You can figure out whether you need to shut down or not based on how that particular price relates to what your average variable cost is. We said all of this again, so I'll let you go through these slides a little slower if you want to. Okay, this is one of the few times where they actually give us a numerical example of doing some of this stuff. So there's Aztec Electronics, and I'm sure you can look in the textbook and see some of the more details about this. We'll go kind of fast through this just to save a little bit of time. They've got market power. They sell wireless stereo headphones. We want to get their demand and marginal revenue curves. There's a sort of simplified demand equation. Q equals 50,000 minus 500P. So let's flip it around and get P as a function of Q. 100 minus 1 over 500 times Q. So I could plug that into Excel, you know, at different prices, different quantities, and get this downward sloping demand curve. I want my marginal revenue. So there we go. I can see where that actually comes from. Here's my total revenue equation, multiplying every term of the P equation times Q. So 100Q minus 0.002Q squared. To get marginal revenue, I need the derivative, 100 minus 0.004Q. So again, same intercept, twice the slope. Here's its picture. Squiggly arrows for you. Have to figure out its cost curves. You know, you don't really need to, or I'm not sure why they're not showing the average total cost. I mentioned earlier that we talk about what fixed costs are and average fixed costs. We don't really ever use them in making these decisions. So, you know, if anyone asks you, you could figure it out, but it's just not a whole lot of interest to the decisions we have to make about price and quantity. So let's say you get some data here on your costs, you get these messy equations out of it. You can plug those in. I see that the average variable cost and marginal cost are both quadratics, so they're going to be U-shaped, like I expect them to be. I have equations for marginal revenue and marginal cost, and I can solve for Q. Now look how nice this is. We'll just continue on here. I get this simplified equation. I've got to use the quadratic formula. Remember that? That was probably sophomore year of high school. You guys probably had mullets or something, at least the guys did, but I'm not sure what kind of hair girls had. I wasn't paying that much attention. They weren't paying attention to me either. So this quadratic equation, oh yeah, that looks fantastic. So you can do that, figure all that junk out, and it magically turns into 6,000 as your output. Once I know that, and of course you just go to the stats guys in your office and tell them to solve that quadratic equation for you. Once they give you the Q, you can easily take that into your demand equation and figure out what price you need. Compare that to what the average variable cost is. You know, as long as the price is above average variable cost, you know that your company's going to stay open. Whether it's profitable or not is kind of a different question, but you at least know whether you should shut down or not if your price is above average variable. So we know they're going to produce. You can calculate the total profit fairly easily. Visually, we want to figure out where the marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. So now I've got, well, hopefully you can spot where the short run marginal cost curve is. And you can see the sort of the grayish marginal revenue line. So that's my quantity. And I can see where that price is. I can see, in this case, the price B is above my average total cost. Oh, there we go. They indicate that with the point C. So I can see that I'm profitable.